Dog saves a lost girl in the woods, but what he led her to will leave you in tears. Emily? Emily? Sarah's voice echoed through the dense woods as she turned in circles, scanning for any sign of her 7-year-old daughter. Her heart raced, each second of silence gnawing at her nerves. She was just here, Sarah said, her voice trembling as she grabbed her husband's arm. Mark, gripping a flashlight, tried to steady her. We'll find her. She can't have gone far. Minutes earlier, Emily had been playing near their campsite, chasing a small squirrel that darted in and out of the bushes. Distracted for just a moment, Sarah turned to find her daughter gone. Mark shouted into the forest, "Emily? Come back, honey?" His voice was firm, but fear seeped through his tone. They split up, searching through the immediate area. Sarah retraced Emily's steps near the clearing while Mark ventured deeper into the woods, pushing through the underbrush with his flashlight cutting through the shadows. She wouldn't wander far, Sarah whispered to herself, but the stillness of the forest was deafening. The fading sunlight turned the scene darker, and a cold breeze swept through the trees. As the minutes stretched to an hour, Mark returned to the clearing, shaking his head. "Nothing," he said, his jaw tight. He reached for his phone. "I'm calling for help." Back at the campsite, the ranger station was contacted, and soon volunteers began arriving with flashlights, thermal blankets, and dogs to assist in the search. Among them was Jacob, a man in his 40s who lived near the woods. Standing quietly to the side, he held the leash of his golden retriever, Rocky, who wagged his tail, eager to join the effort. "That dog's got a nose for this kind of thing," a volunteer commented as Jacob nodded. Sarah looked at Jacob, her face pale with desperation. "Please, if he can help." "He can," Jacob interrupted gently. Without wasting another moment, he unhooked Rocky's leash. "Find her, boy," Jacob commanded. Rocky lowered his nose to the ground and sniffed intently before bolting toward the edge of the forest. The search party quickly followed. "Please let him find her," Sarah whispered as she stumbled after them, clutching her husband's arm. In the darkness of the woods, every second counted. Rocky darted into the forest, his golden coat barely visible under the dim light of the moon. His movements were deliberate, his nose glued to the ground as he weaved through the dense brush. Jacob jogged closely behind, the leash still clutched in his hand. Behind him, the volunteers fanned out, calling Emily's name into the vastness of the night. Sarah and Mark trailed the group, their flashlights trembling as they scanned every shadow. "Emily?" Sarah cried, her voice cracking with desperation. Mark gripped her shoulder, steadying her. "Rocky knows what he's doing," Jacob reassured them, his voice calm but firm. The air grew colder as they pushed deeper into the forest. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the occasional snap of a twig reminded them how far they'd wandered from the safety of the campsite. Rocky suddenly stopped, his ears pricking up. He sniffed the air, then barked sharply, his tail wagging with purpose. Jacob froze. "He's found something." Everyone hurried to catch up. Rocky led them to a small clearing, where the dirt was disturbed, and tiny footprints were visible in the soft ground. Sarah gasped, dropping to her knees to examine them. "These are hers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know they are." Jacob studied the tracks. "She came through here recently," he confirmed. "But look," he pointed to a faint trail leading away from the clearing. "She's moving deeper into the woods." Mark looked at Sarah, his face pale. "She's probably scared. We have to keep going." Jacob signaled for Rocky to continue, and the dog bounded forward, his barking echoing in the stillness. As they followed him, the tension in the group grew heavier. The forest seemed to close in around them, the thick canopy blocking out what little light remained. "Emily?" Mark shouted again, his voice growing hoarse. Then Rocky stopped abruptly, letting out a low growl. Jacob crouched beside him, placing a hand on the dog's back. "What is it, boy?" Rocky sniffed the air and began pulling Jacob toward a dense cluster of bushes. The group watched in silence as the dog began digging at the base of the shrubs. Jacob's heart pounded as he leaned closer. "Emily?" he called softly. A faint whimper came from the other side of the bushes. Sarah gasped, rushing forward. "Emily?" Sarah's breath hitched as she dropped to her knees beside the bushes, frantically pushing the branches aside. "Emily? Baby, are you there?" she called, her voice trembling. A small, muffled voice replied, "Mommy?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she reached out, her flashlight illuminating a pair of wide, tearful eyes. Emily was curled up tightly, her arms hugging her knees, her little body shivering from the cold. "Oh, my baby," Sarah cried, pulling Emily into her arms. The girl clung to her mother, burying her face into Sarah's jacket as sobs racked her tiny frame. Mark dropped to his knees beside them, wrapping both of them in his arms. "We've got you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now." Jacob stood back, his hand resting on Rocky's head. The dog wagged his tail softly, his job seemingly done. But something in Rocky's demeanor changed. He sniffed the air again, his ears perking up. "Good boy, Rocky," Jacob murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "But what is it now?" Emily pulled back slightly from her parents, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rocky didn't just find me. He wants to show us something," she said, pointing toward the direction Rocky was staring. Sarah exchanged a glance with Mark, their relief momentarily overshadowed by confusion. Jacob crouched beside Emily. "He's been acting like that since we got here," he said. "It's like he's trying to lead us somewhere." Rocky barked once, sharp and urgent, then took a few steps forward before looking back at the group. "Should we follow him?" Mark asked, hesitating. Jacob nodded. "If Rocky thinks it's important, it probably is. He hasn't let us down yet." Carrying Emily in his arms, Mark followed Jacob and Rocky deeper into the forest. Sarah clutched her husband's arm, unwilling to let her daughter out of reach. The group moved cautiously, the atmosphere shifting from relief to unease. After a short walk, Rocky stopped at a small clearing, where a crude wooden cross stood partially buried in the earth. Jacob froze, his breath catching in his throat. His face paled as he took a step back, recognition washing over him. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but laced with concern. Jacob didn't answer immediately. His hands trembled as he stared at the cross. "This," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "This is where I lost my daughter." Silence enveloped the group as Jacob's words hung in the air. Mark tightened his hold on Emily, sensing the sudden heaviness in Jacob's tone. Sarah glanced at the wooden cross, her heart sinking as the pieces began to fall into place. "You lost your daughter here?" Sarah asked softly, her voice trembling. Jacob nodded, his eyes fixed on the cross. "It was years ago," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "She was about Emily's age, curious, adventurous just like her." He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "We came here for a picnic, just a normal day. I looked away for a moment and when I turned back she was gone." His voice cracked and Rocky, sensing his distress, nudged Jacob's leg gently with his nose. Jacob reached down to stroke the dog's head, drawing strength from the simple gesture. "We searched for hours," he continued, his eyes distant as if replaying the memory in his mind. "I screamed her name until my throat gave out. When we finally found her, it was too late. She'd fallen into a ravine nearby. I never even knew it was there until that day." A wave of silence swept through the group. Emily, still nestled in her father's arms, whispered, "I'm sorry." Jacob crouched down so he was at eye level with her, a faint, bittersweet smile softening his features. "It's not your fault, sweetheart," he said gently. "Rocky made sure you're safe and that's what matters." Sarah glanced at the cross again, her heart aching for Jacob. "You put this here for her, didn't you?" He nodded. "I come back here sometimes just to sit and remember her. But Rocky hasn't led me here in years. It's like he knew tonight was different." Mark shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Jacob and the cross. "Why would he lead us here now?" he asked, his tone cautious. Jacob hesitated, his hand resting on the wooden cross. "Maybe to remind me that even after all this time, there's still hope." His voice broke, but he steadied himself quickly. "Maybe it's his way of telling me it's time to stop living in the past and focus on what I can still protect." Sarah wiped away a tear, reaching out to place a comforting hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You saved our daughter tonight," she said softly. "And maybe she saved you too." Jacob looked at Emily, who smiled shyly at him. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of guilt and grief on his shoulders seemed to lift, replaced by a small glimmer of peace. The clearing was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Jacob sat down beside the wooden cross, his fingers brushing the rough surface as he stared into the distance. The memories of his daughter surged, vivid and unrelenting, yet mingled now with the relief of having found Emily safe. Sarah knelt beside him, Emily still clinging to her arm. "Jacob," she said gently, "what you've been through. I can't imagine the pain. But tonight, you helped us in a way we'll never be able to repay." Jacob shook his head, his voice firm despite the weight in it. "You don't owe me anything. If anything, I owe Rocky. I think he knew I needed to come back here, not just for you but for me too." Mark, still standing protectively close to his wife and daughter, asked cautiously, "Why haven't you come back before? It seems like you've stayed away for a long time." Jacob exhaled deeply, his hand resting on Rocky's head. After it happened, I couldn't face this place. I blamed myself for not keeping her safe. I built this cross as a way to honor her, but coming here always felt like punishment instead of peace. He looked at Emily, his expression softening. Seeing her, though, it's like I finally understand something my grief never let me see. It's not about what I lost. It's about what I can still protect, what I can still do for others. Emily, nestled in her mother's lap, looked up at him. Her small voice broke the stillness. Did your daughter like dogs? Jacob smiled, a flicker of warmth crossing his face. She loved them, he said softly. Rocky came into my life after I lost her. I wasn't looking for him, but he found me just like he found you tonight. Emily reached out her hand tentatively, and Rocky sniffed it before giving her a gentle lick. She giggled, the sound breaking the tension in the air. Maybe your daughter sent Rocky to you, Emily said thoughtfully, her innocence piercing through Jacob's guarded heart. Jacob looked at the cross again, his throat tightening. For years he had carried the weight of loss, but for the first time he allowed himself to feel gratitude. Maybe she did, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Sarah reached out, placing a comforting hand on Jacob's arm. You didn't just help us find Emily, she said softly. You reminded us what it means to truly hold on to hope. The group sat together in the clearing for a while longer, bound by an unspoken understanding. For Jacob, the weight of the past began to shift, replaced if only slightly by a renewed sense of purpose. And for Emily's family, the fear of the night was slowly overshadowed by a deep, abiding gratitude. Rocky sat quietly beside Jacob, his job not yet done, but his presence offering the kind of comfort that words could never fully capture. The clearing faded into the darkness behind them as Jacob led the way back toward the main trail. Sarah walked close to him, her hand resting protectively on Emily's shoulder, while Mark followed with a flashlight, scanning the path ahead. Rocky moved with quiet purpose, staying close to Jacob but glancing back at Emily every so often, as if reassuring himself that she was safe. The group moved slowly, their steps careful as the uneven forest floor threatened to trip them. The night was quieter now, the earlier tension easing into a somber calm. Emily leaned her head against her mother, her small voice breaking the silence. "Mommy, I was so scared," she whispered, clutching Sarah's jacket tightly. Sarah stopped walking, crouching down to hold Emily close. "I know, sweetheart," she said softly. "But you were so brave. And Rocky found you, didn't he?" Emily nodded, looking over at the golden retriever with wide eyes. "He stayed with me until you came. He didn't leave me." Jacob, overhearing, turned slightly. "That's what Rocky does," he said with a small smile. "He always stays." The words carried more weight than Jacob intended, and Sarah caught the slight tremor in his voice. "He's not just a dog, is he?" she asked gently. Jacob paused, his hand resting on Rocky's head. "No," he admitted. "He's more than that. After I lost my daughter, I shut everyone out. I didn't want to feel anything anymore. Then Rocky came along, stubborn as anything, and wouldn't let me stay stuck in my grief. He gave me a reason to keep going." Mark, walking just behind them, cleared his throat. "Sounds like he's been saving people long before tonight." Jacob chuckled softly, glancing down at the dog. "Yeah, I suppose he has." As they reached the edge of the forest, the faint glow of flashlights from the search party became visible through the trees. Voices called out, and the distant sound of a search dog barking carried through the air. Relief swept over Sarah as she picked up her pace, Emily still clutching her tightly. "We're almost there," Mark said, his voice steady for the first time in hours. Rocky barked once, a sharp, joyful sound as if to confirm they were headed in the right direction. Jacob looked back at the path they had taken, his eyes lingering for a moment on the darkness they had left behind. "This isn't just about finding her," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's about what we all find when we face what's been holding us back." Sarah glanced at him but said nothing, sensing that Jacob's journey through the night had been as much about healing as it had been about helping. As they broke through the tree-line, the search party rushed toward them, voices shouting in relief and gratitude. Emily's name echoed in the air, and her parents' embrace tightened around her as they stepped forward to meet the crowd. But Jacob hung back, his hand resting on Rocky's back. For now his job was done. The crowd surged toward Sarah and Mark, flashlights cutting through the darkness as relieved faces emerged from the shadows. Emily clung tightly to her mother, blinking against the sudden brightness and noise. A woman in uniform stepped forward, likely the head of the search team, and knelt to meet Emily's eyes. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly, her smile warm. "Are you okay? You gave everyone quite a scare." Emily nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm okay. Rocky found me. The officer looked up at Jacob and his golden retriever, her expression softening. Good work, Rocky, she said, scratching behind his ears. Rocky wagged his tail but stayed close to Jacob's side, his eyes scanning the crowd. Mark stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, he said to Jacob, extending a hand. You and Rocky, you saved her. Jacob hesitated, then shook his hand firmly. Rocky did the saving, he replied, his tone humble. I just followed where he led. Sarah hugged Emily closer, her voice trembling as she spoke. I don't know how to thank you. If it weren't for you? Her words trailed off and tears welled in her eyes. You don't have to thank me, Jacob said softly. I know what it's like to lose someone. If there's anything I could do to keep that from happening to someone else, I would. The officer stepped in gently. We need to check Emily out, just to make sure she's all right, she said, motioning toward the paramedics waiting by one of the vehicles. Emily glanced at Rocky, her small hand reaching out toward him. Can he come with me? She asked, her voice trembling. Jacob crouched beside her, meeting her eyes. Rocky's got a little more work to do here, he said gently. But I promise he'll come see you again. Okay? Emily hesitated, then nodded, reluctantly letting go of the dog. As the paramedics ushered the family toward the ambulance, Jacob stayed behind with the remaining volunteers. Rocky sat at his feet, his tail wagging softly as the crowd began to disperse. One of the volunteers clapped Jacob on the shoulder. You've got one hell of a dog there, the man said. Jacob nodded, his gaze fixed on Emily as she disappeared into the ambulance with her parents. Yeah, he said quietly. He's something special. For a moment, Jacob stood alone, the night quieting around him. The weight of his memories lingered, but something else had taken root, a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Rocky nudged his leg, breaking him from his thoughts. Jacob smiled, scratching the dog behind his ears. All right, boy, he said softly. Let's head home. The following day, the soft morning light filtered through the trees as Jacob sat on the steps of his small cabin. Rocky lay beside him, his golden fur glowing warmly in the sunlight. The events of the previous night replayed in Jacob's mind. The fear in Emily's parents' eyes, the relief that washed over them, and the quiet courage of the little girl who had trusted Rocky without hesitation. Jacob sipped his coffee, his gaze distant. For years, he had avoided the weight of his past, hiding in the solitude of the woods. But now, the memory of his daughter felt different, less like a wound that refused to heal and more like a part of his story he could carry with peace. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. He set down his mug and opened the door to find Sarah, Mark, and Emily standing on his porch. Emily held a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands, her face lighting up at the sight of Rocky. Good morning, Sarah said with a warm smile. We hope we're not disturbing you. Jacob shook his head, stepping aside to let them in. Not at all, he said. What brings you all the way out here? Emily stepped forward, holding out the bouquet. These are for you and Rocky, she said shyly. Jacob crouched down, accepting the flowers with a soft smile. Thank you, Emily, he said. They're beautiful. Sarah glanced around the cozy cabin, her eyes lingering on a framed photo of a little girl on the mantel. We wanted to thank you properly, she said, her voice gentle. Not just for finding Emily but for what you shared with us last night. It couldn't have been easy. Jacob's gaze followed hers to the photo. It wasn't, he admitted. But it felt right. Like something I needed to do. Mark nodded, his tone earnest. You helped us understand something important. Losing sight of Emily, even for those few hours, made us realize how precious every moment with her is. I don't think we'll ever take that for granted again. Jacob leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. It's easy to forget that when life gets busy, he said. But it's never too late to start paying attention to what matters. Emily knelt beside Rocky, her small hand stroking his fur. He's the best dog ever, she said with a giggle. Jacob chuckled. Yeah, he is, he said. As the family prepared to leave, Sarah turned back. If you ever feel like you need company, she said, you're always welcome at our home. And if it's okay, Emily would love to visit Rocky again. Jacob smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. I'd like that, he said simply. As they walked down the path toward their car, Jacob watched them go, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude. For the first time in years, his world didn't feel quite so small. Rocky nudged his leg as if sensing the shift. Looks like you brought me more than just a little girl last night, huh? Jacob said, scratching behind the dog's ears. Rocky wagged his tail, content. For Jacob, the forest no longer felt like a place of isolation but one of connection, healing, and hope. And for the first time he was ready to share that with others. Weeks passed and life settled into a calmer rhythm. The memory of that fateful night in the woods lingered, but now it was a source of strength rather than sorrow. Jacob spent his days tending to his small cabin, taking Rocky on long walks, and reflecting on how much had changed, not just for Emily's family but for himself. One crisp morning, as the sun climbed above the treetops, Jacob decided to return to the clearing. With Rocky trotting faithfully beside him, they followed the familiar path into the forest. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of leaves and pine. When they arrived, the wooden cross stood quietly in its place, weathered but sturdy. Jacob knelt down, brushing away some fallen leaves at its base. His fingers lingered on the wood, and for the first time he didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt. Instead, there was a sense of peace, as though the forest itself had forgiven him, or perhaps he had finally forgiven himself. "She'd be proud of you, wouldn't she?" Jacob murmured, glancing at Rocky. The dog tilted his head, his golden eyes steady and full of understanding. A rustling behind them broke the quiet. Jacob turned to see Emily and her parents walking toward him. Sarah carried a small basket, and Emily held a piece of paper in her hand. "Hope we're not interrupting," Sarah said softly. Jacob stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Not at all," he replied. "What brings you out here?" Emily stepped forward, holding out the paper. "I made this for you and Rocky," she said shyly. Jacob took the paper and unfolded it. It was a drawing of the clearing with the cross in the center. Beside it, she had drawn herself holding hands with Rocky and Jacob. Above the trees, a bright sun shone down. "That's beautiful, Emily," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Sarah placed the basket at the base of the cross. "We thought it would be nice to leave something here," she said. "A way to remember what this place means, not just to you but to all of us now." Jacob nodded, his throat tight. "It means a lot to me," he said. "More than I can say." Mark stepped closer, resting a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You've given us more than we could ever repay," he said. "But I hope you know, you're not alone anymore." Jacob looked at the family, his chest swelling with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," he said quietly. As they stood together in the clearing, the sun broke through the canopy, casting golden rays over the cross. Rocky barked once, his tail wagging furiously, as if he too understood the significance of the moment. Jacob smiled, kneeling to wrap his arms around the dog. "You've always known, haven't you, boy?" he murmured. Emily ran over and hugged Rocky tightly. "The best dog ever," she said, giggling. For Jacob, the clearing was no longer just a place of loss. It was a place of connection, healing, and hope. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for light to break through. As they left the forest together, Jacob glanced back one last time. This time he didn't feel the ache of the past. Instead, he felt ready for whatever lay ahead, with Rocky by his side and a newfound sense of purpose in his heart. Sometimes life's darkest paths lead us to the brightest light. Jacob's journey reminds us that even in moments of profound loss, there is hope waiting to be found, often in unexpected ways. A little girl, a loyal dog, and a single night in the woods brought a man back to life and a family closer than ever. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Who or what has been your light in the dark? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who might need a reminder that hope is always within reach. And if you want to see more stories that touch your heart, subscribe to our channel today. Together, let's keep spreading messages of courage, connection, and hope. You never know who might need it.